Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday, and congrats to those of you who are up early and in this webinar first thing on a Monday. I'm Paul Butler. I'm New America's President and Chief Transformation Officer. I'm delighted to welcome all of you today. I'm thrilled to have both a new friend and an old friend in this conversation on meeting the needs of the 21st century workforce. Our two distinguished panelists today are Cecilia Muñoz and Anthony Foxx. Anthony is the Chief Policy Officer and Senior Advisor to the President and CEO at Lyft, where he works alongside the co-founders and the executive team at the intersection of transportation policy, technology, and public-private partnerships. He is the former Secretary of Transportation, where his primary goal was to ensure that America maintain the safest, most efficient transportation system in the world. Cecilia Muñoz is a senior advisor at New America. She recently returned after a brief period leading the domestic and economic policy team for the Biden-Harris transition. She's a national leader in public policy and public interest technology. For 8 years, she served on President Obama's senior staff first as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and then as the Director of the Domestic Policy Council. I can't think of two better people who can help us talk through both the possibilities and the challenges of shaping a policy framework that acknowledges the ways in which work is changing, and also ensuring that we're providing the protections that workers need and deserve. So with that, I will turn it over to Cecilia.
Thank you so much, Paul. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Paul, thank you for hosting and opening. And especially thanks to you, Anthony, for joining us this morning. If I were kind of following DC protocol, I'm in the DC area myself, I would be calling you Secretary Foxx, but I've known you for a long time. I know Paul, you and Paul go back a long way. So I'm gonna stick with Anthony, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
We're really grateful that you're here. This is a really important moment for this conversation. So we really appreciate your willingness to have it. So I'm going to set the stage for a minute, and then you and I will have a conversation, but I want to invite our audience to send in questions. You can use the Q&A function or the chat to send us your questions. We want to make sure to have as robust a conversation as possible. But let me set the stage for a second. So even before COVID, the workforce was changing. By one pre-pandemic estimate, more than a third of workers were involved in some way in the gig economy. And I should disclose that one of them is my daughter, who among many other things has driven for Lyft. The rise of the gig economy has meant a lot of things. Flexibility for workers, convenience for consumers, but it also has to be said, growing concern about the power dynamics in the workplace. The rise of the gig economy is happening at the same time as shrinking in the labor movement. And in some ways, I understand this dynamic as the way the workforce worked in my father's generation. My father worked in the auto industry for the same company for almost 40 years. There were unions, there was paid time off, there were retirement benefits, there was healthcare. And my daughter is more like a gig worker, including, driving for Lyft and other things. And a lot of those structures that I grew up with, growing up in the household where my father was working, are not present in her life. So there is an intense conversation underway about what protections workers need and want, what kind of flexibility workers need and want, and what we might achieve in this new economy. Add to that what we've learned from the pandemic. We're all rethinking what we need to work and live effectively. Economic uncertainty forces employers to do more with less. The pandemic has exposed a lot of policy weaknesses. I come at this conversation as a policy nerd. The pandemic has exposed weaknesses in our infrastructure around things like childcare, paid sick leave, paid family leave. It's emphasized for many the need for flexibility in the workplace, which is one of the things at issue here. So we're all thinking about this. Employers are thinking about it, workers are thinking about it, policymakers. So hopefully, as we emerge from this pandemic, and I knock on wood as I say that, in the hope that we are really emerging successfully, there's a opportunity to have a conversation about how we make work better for everybody, how we update the benefits and safety nets, how we update our workplaces, how we update our systems to reflect the workforce really the reality of the 21st century workforce and what it needs. So Anthony, you've been on the front lines of all of these challenges. You led a Department of Transportation that was really focused on equity in a way that I greatly admired. And now you're leading policy, among other things, at Lyft. What should a company like Lyft be doing to lead the sector to making sure that more jobs are good jobs?
Well, Cecilia, first of all, thank you and thank Paul for hosting this discussion. And in listening to your setup, Cecilia, I'm reminded of how much I miss being in these conversations about such weighty topics with you. So that's a credit to you, obviously. Um, I think that what a company like Lyft has to do in this moment is to recognize that the intensity of inertia in terms of how traditional employment and independent contracting concepts have been built up over decades. Respect the fact that there are institutional imperatives that labor has, that the workforce has. There's so many different constituencies involved in this conversation. But at the end of the day, I think we have to be pioneers in trying to get to the right balance here. And we firmly believe that that while our workforce, while the drivers want to be independent, they want to be flexible in terms of working for different platforms at any given time for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. That flexibility can and should be undergirded by a safety net, and what that safety net is, what its parameters are, I think is something that we have an obligation to continue to work with all stakeholders to sort out. But we do have some pretty definite ideas about what it can be part of.
Yeah. So what would you say, like what's your, I mean, if you had the magic policy wand or the magic employer wand,
Yeah.
like what's the world that we should be working towards in your view?
So the world today is you're either an independent contractor, in which case there is no real safety net underneath you, and you have freedom of movement, but you also have a fair amount of risk associated with that, or the employment model, which doesn't work for people that want to work on multiple platforms. For example, people who want maximum flexibility, control their time. So what it should look like, in my view, is it should look like a couple of things. One, the protection should follow the worker, not necessarily who they're working for. And there are concepts like sectoral bargaining in labor that have been discussed and debated, that are active in some parts of Europe. I think we're going to have to move to a more worker-centric model, and that includes the protections following the worker, whether that be benefits, childcare, the things that you just talked about. I think there's a component of a floor, an earnings floor underneath drivers and folks that are working these types of jobs, so that there's a baseline level of earning that they understand that they'll meet under certain circumstances. And I also think that we're going to have to ensure that the benefits are portable, whatever they happen to be, and that each company pays a proportionate share of that worker's benefits based on how much that worker has been doing for each platform.
So these are good conversations for policymakers, and important ones, right?
Yeah.
And we're in the middle of a policy conversation in a bunch of states, but also in DC around things like leave, which we know 40 million workers in the US don't have access to paid leave even when they're sick, right? The pandemic has really taught us what at some level what we knew before, but it's kind of taught us in a new way why it's bad for everybody, not just the workers themselves, not to have access to sick leave, right? We understand how much that increases risk for all of us. So your Lyft is one company, but it's a visible company, a powerful company. So are you engaged in the policy conversation? Like, should you be engaged in the policy conversation? How can one company help change the sector?
Well, I think one way that we've tried to be involved in the conversation is as these issues have come up at the state level, we've tried to sit down with all the stakeholders, whether that be legislators, regulators, labor interest, drivers, obviously, to sort out what the opportunity is for everybody to create a win-win. I would say that that Prop 22 in California, while I think, you know, some people would criticize it, it wasn't done with a lack of trying to get the parties to the table. And we've recently in New York been involved in conversations that have been very productive. And frankly, for the first time, we were starting to hear voices in labor say, hey, there's an opportunity here to get to a win-win solution, which is really, I think, the sweet spot for everybody. So the clock ran out on us in New York. We're going to try to come back, working locked arms with everybody there to try to get to a solution. But I think what we're quickly going to find is that as this issue continues to debate across the country, we could end up with a patchwork of different solutions. And so we want to stay very involved in the federal conversation about these issues, because if there's a chance to create a win-win at the federal level, we should try to do that.
And in your view, what does a win-win look like? Like, what are the?
Well, I think it's a solution that provides the certainty around whatever the category is of the worker we're talking about. So the certainty around the classification, I think there's a need to create potentially a third category, a new category of work that carries some of the benefits of employment, but also some of the benefits of independent contracting, i.e. a greater benefit structure for the worker, as well as the certainty that the flexible type of work that these workers are doing is allowed by law, and the provision of benefits by companies like Lyft to those workers isn't going to get them pushed into an employment category unintentionally. So I think that's the general concept. I think there are a lot of other pieces of that. I would say, again, on the benefit side, that if a worker's working 20% for Lyft, 20% for a company that starts with U that shall not be named, and 20% for three other companies, that each company is contributing their proportionate share to that worker's benefits, however they're defined, and the worker should then have the ability to choose which benefits they want. Maybe they want to have sick time. Maybe they want to have a couple of days off. Maybe they want to invest in Obamacare or something. So I think there should be wide flexibility to the worker in terms of defining which benefits they want, but each company should have a way of paying into that without forcing that worker to become an employee.
And do you need public policy in order to make that happen? Is it possible for a company to just move forward?
It's a great question. So there's a lot of debate, at least assertions made that this type of system could exist under an employment model. The problem is that in an industry like rideshare, if that provision of benefits is made, there is a risk that you'll end up putting the worker in an employment category. And if that happens, what is likely to happen is that companies are going to want to commandeer all of that person's time. So it goes from being kind of interim work, part-time work, to being full-time work. And what we find is that 96% of our drivers are doing something else outside of driving. They're students, perhaps like your daughter might have been when she was driving, or doing other full-time employment someplace else. So we don't want to penalize people for using this platform as a way of finding additional income to do things they want to do.
And what have you learned that you feel like policymakers should know about what your drivers, what the people who work using the Lyft platform need, why this as opposed to other alternatives, and what might be like, what are things that you've learned that you think policymakers need to know?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, when we spend a lot of time talking to our drivers, and 83% of them, and we've asked this question multiple times in multiple venues all over the country, and 83% of them want to remain flexible. They don't want to be employees because uh, they will lose some degree of latitude over how they choose to work. Um, I also mentioned that 96% of our drivers are doing some type of work outside of the Lyft platform. Many of them are students. Some of them have family members who have a healthcare situation that they have to tend to, and they can't hold down full-time employment, but this type of work fits what they need. And so there are all kinds of situations that exist out there. And I would hope that public policymakers would have some sympathy for the fact that, this isn't just, a mean kind of spirited corporate push to prevent people from being employees. What we are doing is we're saying, look, there's a way to solve the problem the worker has, which is wanting more protections. Many of them do want more protections, but they don't want those protections at the cost of their flexibility.
And so I struggle in thinking about this, right? I'm a person, and as I know you are too, who has spent a good part of my career thinking about and working on equity, thinking about and working on issues of worker power, thinking about economic inequality and the extent to which it is expanding in the United States. And the thing that I can't figure out, where there's, I think, evidence going in multiple directions, is this notion that on the one hand, driving on a platform like Lyft can be, as you say, to a student, a relatively lightweight way to add income, or for a worker in another job, a way to add income for something special or for a major need. But it can also be an expression of the fact that the other work that people are doing isn't enough to help for them to feed their families, and they're taking the whatever moments they have while the kids are in school, or whatever it is, because income isn't enough, because our economy is not actually providing what people need. I mean, do you see both of those things? Are both of those things true simultaneously? Is it more one or another?
I think that you're putting your finger on the complexity of work at this moment in time in this country. And, frankly, I think that every category of work could stand to be improved. So, a $15 minimum wage, for example, that should be table stakes for where we are as a country. And when you add into the equation things like, child care, paid leave when people have children, healthcare. There are a number of things that I think even traditional employment needs to do better at. And as that happens, more people who are looking to various forms of work have more and better choices. So, I say it all the time that that part of the reason why this type of work exists is, it's because some people need for it to exist. And so they shouldn't be penalized for it, right? We should find a way to make it meaningful. On the other hand, we do want employment to be as good as it can be too, because we don't want people to be forced into doing this type of work. So I think it's a delicate balance. But again, I think that if we're thinking about the worker, and this is the real opportunity that I see right now, is that so for so long when we were in public policy circles, the debate about the worker kind of traveled through the employer. Mm-hmm. And so but what if there was an intrinsic kind of notion of the worker having the choice to go to an employer and to take that bargain, or to stand as their own agent, is effectively their own individual business unit, and to have a category of protections that sat there for them if they chose to do work that was more flexible. So I think the real problem we have is that there is so much institutional um, inertia behind the status quo that people are working so hard to defend. And I understand it. Having been in public policy myself, I totally understand it. But there is a real win for workers here if we can both improve employment and work to create a category of work that provides this type of third way, if you will.
And so what, I mean, you've been a policymaker, then what does the way forward look like to accomplish that, right? So there's a little bit of there's a lot of standoff here in Washington. But there's also a little bit of a standoff on this question of, are we applying the rules of the economy as it was to this new economy? And that is a worthy fight. Sure. Because it's really about, it really is, it's being driven by folks who are concerned about workers and concerned about worker voice, yeah. Right? And legitimately concerned about, if each worker is an individual unit, yeah. How do we ultimately get to a place, right, where they're, as a group, well served and well represented?
Sure.
So you described getting close in New York to a win-win situation. What's the path to a win-win here?
Well, in New York, and I'm not revealing any state secrets here because some of this stuff was published, but in New York, one of the interesting components of what was being discussed was bargaining for this category of workers. And I know that's a big deal for this president and for this administration to strengthen labor rights. In this case, in order to do that, and to do it while maintaining the integrity of the flexibility the workers have, one has to allow that bargaining to occur across multiple platforms. And I think, as much as that may be seen as a progressive step to some extent, there's also a lot of institutional challenges with getting that done, because in America, for the most part, the labor rights kind of extend between the group of employees that are unionized and the employer. So in my transportation world, the workers that work for Delta Airlines, and there were different categories of them, had agreements with Delta. But what if that worker now could work for Delta, United, American Airlines? Now you have to have an agreement that all of those different employers, in that case, would agree to terms that would follow the worker across those different platforms. So, I get the bottom line is I think the concept is there. And in New York, we got very, very close, I would say, to getting there before the clock ran out, which is the good news. But I think the stakeholders are going to have to, and when I say stakeholders, I think largely it's our friends in labor. I think the hard question there is, are we ready to make the trip from a bilateral kind of an employee employer kind of arrangement to one that is more broad and more sector based, that would allow both organizing, the benefit structure to be put in place, and the flexibility to exist at the same time.
And as you know, the Biden administration, President Biden, obviously has strong and deep ties to the labor movement.
Yeah.
Going back a long way. That's I learned working in the transition, and obviously as we worked with him in the previous administration, that's a deep thing for him as a human and as a policymaker. Does that put you more at odds? Does that put a company like Lyft more at odds with the current administration? Is that is it possibly a confidence building measure that there is an administration at the table which is so deeply committed to the success of the labor movement, or is it an obstacle in your view?
I think it's an opportunity, and I think, and the opportunity is if there's an openness either at the federal level or at the state level in a place like New York, to engaging both, companies like ours, as well as the labor movement, as well as workers directly. I think there are infinite ways for this issue to get resolved in a way that is good for workers, good for labor, good for certainty among these businesses. I think it's where we start with the position that we're opposed to each other, where it gets really tough because, in my view at least, and this goes way back, this runs deep for me too. um, you know, I, I don't want us to be on a side that doesn't advance the rights and the opportunities for the workforce that signs up for this platform. So we have been at the table in California for a long time. We'll stay at the table in New York. And if a tabletop is established at the federal level, we'll be there too, because getting this right is critical. And as long as I think sometimes the uh, the energy to push this industry into being against it is actually not the case for us. And so we're always trying to find a way to extend a hand and not a closed fist. So that's the best way I can put it.
Thank you. So there's and I see questions coming in. We're going to turn to them in a minute. I have one more big one, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. And that is, so there is I think at least a pilot and a new model emerging just in the last week in news that was made by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, where they reached an agreement with there's a platform that domestic workers and people who employ them use, called Handy, and they reached an agreement. It was reported, they reported it actually in an op-ed that ran on CNN last week, an agreement in 3 states through which domestic workers will get paid $15 an hour. They will get paid leave, paid for by the platform, and they will get voice, in the sense that there will be workers meeting with the company brass, right, with CEO and others regularly, often, as a way of getting a foothold and worker voice. Now, this is not a traditional labor union model, but it is an advance, and it's an advance, I should note, for workers who are among the very most vulnerable of any sector, who are mostly people of color, mostly women of color. And so this is it's an experiment, but it strikes me as a really, really important experiment. I would just love to hear what your views. Is this a potential model for a company like Lyft? Is this something you want to watch? Like, what's your sense?
Yeah, I think there are definitely components of that pilot that make a lot of sense. I think the hard part I'm going to kind of expose some of the hard parts on this end of things, which is we aspire to something that is industry wide for us, and that may be an aspiration that maybe it's a bridge too far. I don't think so, but what that means is that when we're in discussions about what the art of the possible is for us as Lyft, we're also kind of tethered to the other companies in this space, and the points along the way that maybe one company is willing to do and another company isn't, starts to define this whole thing. But it gets back to what I said before. If the goal here is to do, to give the flexibility that our drivers are telling us they want, then we kind of have to do that, because otherwise there's an arrangement with Lyft, there's a different arrangement with other companies, and the worker has this marketplace of different things that they may choose between, but it actually ends up making it less of a fulsome marketplace for the workers and for the companies, frankly. So for us, the complicating factor here is, can we get agreement across our industry as to what makes sense, and then can that be something that's attractive to the drivers, something that's attractive to the other interests that are involved, including labor. Does that make sense?
It does. It's complicated.
Yeah.
Uh, and right, challenging to think that you all have to come to agreement as a sector among your competitors in order to figure out a policy that works for everybody. It's not an easy thing. So we have a number of questions from our participants, and I urge you to keep them coming. So Alex asks, could sector-specific benefits open the door to a new kind of labor union that protects gig workers in specific sectors, regardless of the specific company they're working for and regardless of their employment status?
I mean, we have one kind of model for that today, which is the Independent Drivers Guild in New York, which is representing a variety of drivers across a couple of platforms, and maybe that's the template for the future. Another thing about New York that I didn't mention is that, you know, the threshold for workers agreeing to join a union has typically been much higher than 10%. That's what it would have been under the legislation that was being worked on. So, voting cards were going to be allowed, which is another big thing for a number of unions as well. So, anyway, we're working hard to try to solve that. But yes, the short answer is that's definitely a possibility.
We have an anonymously asked question about whether the construction union model could be a model here.
Potentially. I mean, again, this conversation that we're having is, I think the likelihood is that there will be an effort by a number of unions, assuming there is some agreement to a framework that would allow bargaining. There's likely to be some competition among unions to get folks signed up, and to do it under an umbrella of a gig specific or perhaps a construction model. So a lot of it remains to be seen, but we're trying to figure out how to get to yes.
So we have a question. I think I don't have a name with the question asking, can you please address the possibilities of implementing universal basic income and universal health care to help workers stay afloat, given the massive growth of the gig economy? Is that something that you think about?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because and I'm gonna nerd out here on income for drivers here for a second. You could divide the driver time into three categories. The category where the app is on and the driver is idle. There's no ride to go to, or they're not looking for a ride. Maybe they're getting lunch or something. Then there's the moment where they're actually going to pick up Cecilia. And then there's the moment when they have Cecilia in the car and they're taking Cecilia someplace. Those are three different points in time. Now, if that person is working at Starbucks, all three of those things are kind of collapsed together. Mm-hmm. But in this business, it's more, there's more separation between the idle time and the time someone's actively going to pick someone up or taking someone someplace. And that idle time ends up being a big issue in the discussion about what an earnings floor is. In California, what we did was we said, okay, we're going to meet the minimum wage, the prevailing minimum wage in any various part of California. And then we're going to add a factor of 20% on top of that to account for the fact that during that idle time, that driver may have been looking for a ride, even though the driver may not have been. We're going to apply a factor there. So the earning standard in California is 120% of the prevailing minimum wage. That is the floor. It's not a ceiling for the driver. And, one could argue whether that percentage, 20% is the right or wrong percentage. But the point is that we were trying to figure out where the sweet spot was between the risk that the driver's spending zero time trying to get a ride and the possibility that the driver's spending more time trying to get a ride. So the bottom line is that is the complicating factor in trying to achieve what is thought of as a minimum earning standard within this environment. And so I do think that is kind of a formulation that can work. And again, one could argue the percentages, but the point is I think full minimum wage equivalent for the time the person's actively driving, plus a factor of time for that time that person is idle. Is that
So
nerdy enough, Cecilia? Sorry.
I love a good nerdy policy, like my sweet spot. I appreciate it greatly.
All right.
So we have a question from James who writes, naturally platforms will pass on the additional cost of providing benefits to drivers onto the customers, or even perhaps the drivers themselves through increased fees. With this reality, he's making a big assumption. But so one, I guess, is confirmation from you of whether or not that assumption is true. But do you, if that's true, do you think ride sharing will remain a viable or potentially profitable industry?
In the ways that we've talked about the benefit side, again, there's a lot of ways that the benefits can be parsed out, but the way we've discussed it is more of like the company paying that out of its own coffers and not expecting the driver to pay for whatever the benefits are. Now, again, if you're talking about, a driver who's doing 20% of their time working with our platform, then we would be putting in 20% of what might be expected as a whole benefit, let's say. So that becomes that, and that's why sectoral bargaining is so important, because if Lyft commits to that, but other platforms don't, then then the driver's getting 20%, but they're never going to get 100%. That's why the sectoral piece is so critical.
So we have there's a question here from Rebecca, which really gets to the question of equity, which is something that I know you care about. In what way will the negotiating structure that's being, different question. No, okay. This is right. In what way will the negotiating structure that's being discussed actually be able to address disparities we see between people who are white and people of color in essential jobs, in entry-level jobs for many sectors, et cetera? It seems that worker power movements must have some race-specific objectives for power to begin to be more equitably distributed, like, for example, the National Black Workers Center. So how does equity play into all of it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think right now the debate is it is so much focused on what is the right terrain for a benefit structure? What is the right model for minimum earnings? With the underpinning being, by the way, many of our rides begin and end in low-income communities. We have high numbers of drivers who are people of color. And so we're part of the whole equity conversation that's happening in the country. And Cecilia, from previous life, that this is something that is critically important to me. But when you hear stories of someone who owns a small business, maybe it's a catering business or something, and they're driving on the side to just hold themselves together so they can put more of their resources into their business, which is not an uncommon story for us. Mm-hmm. The thing that I want to make sure we're doing is that we've got a good deal for that person who's on the platform. And if the basic deal is good, then the 96% of our drivers who are doing other things, including perhaps owning their own business, this is something that is helping them. It's actually helping create equity in the system, as long as the deal is good. And that's where we are right now. Right now, in so many places, there is no floor. In California, there's a floor. There's an earnings floor in California, and that'd be a huge change in a place like New York. So I would love to explore this topic of equity more in this context. But I think the big conversation we're having around the country on economics is the basic bargain that people have the right one for the time we're in, and our industry needs to be asking that question, as traditional employers should be asking that question.
So this is, I think, more a comment from Terry, but I'd like to get a gut check from you on it. So Terry writes that given that the rideshare business model depends on the existence of taxpayer-funded, roads, so being themselves free riders, so to speak, it seems that there's a compelling public interest that would be the basis for federal, state, and local governments to force the sectoral agreements and not depend on the self-interest of companies to work together. What do you think?
There are days when I wish for that. I'm not sure what kind of deal we would get, and whether it would actually be one that would be serviceable. But look, what I'll say is this: we will never stop trying to get active engagement on the part of elected leaders at the state, federal, and even local level where it's relevant to help us solve this problem. And I think the most important thing is getting the parties in a room, and kind of knocking heads and forcing us to solve it, because I think it is solvable.
So we're almost at time, but let me turn to Paul to ask you the closing question, and then Anthony, make any remarks that you want to make to close us out. Paul?
Thanks, Cecilia. So Anthony, as you were talking about bargaining, and then just thinking about the one question that came in about the construction sector, yeah. I'll pose the question first. Is really, are there other models where you see success, other sectors, other industries where you see success, not to maybe borrow the whole model, but maybe Frankenstein elements of that? Where I've worked in terms of my professional background, and I immediately go to that space of media and entertainment. As I think about these issues, I locate them in that space. So I'm wondering if there are other success models or elements of success models that you think about, and if you're borrowing from those, what are those specific elements?
I think the main elements. First of all, I think there are examples of sectoral approaches in Europe, and so they are actively utilized in other parts of the world. So that is potentially a cornerstone, and as part of that, some countries even have a definition of worker that sort of goes outside of the traditional binary approach that our system does. This one. Two is minimum wage as a concept, for the reasons I talked about before, doesn't exactly correlate in this type of world, but I think there's an equivalent that can be developed, and I think we've got a model for that in Prop 22. And again, I would say that the concepts, the conceptual piece of like the active time versus the passive time, and applying some factor for the passive time, is sensible. It's just a question of like getting to agreement on what that number should be. Of course, we answered that question in California. Third, I think we've got to think about a benefit structure. And again, I don't readily know that this exists today, but a benefit structure that says, these categories of benefits are available to a worker on this platform. Now, they can choose. They're not going to be able to get 100% out of a company they're spending 20% of their time with, but they'll get a proportionate share, and those benefits will be chosen by that worker. And so that is another tenet that I would put in place here. And I think the last pillar and an important one is that we have to get comfortable with the fact that today a platform like ours that provides those benefits a lot of times gets accused of being an employer. And what that does is then sort of unravels the flexibility that the worker themselves wants. And so having certainty around uh, the category of worker we're talking about, and perhaps creating a new category so that we can really step into the 21st century here. I think those are sort of the pillars of what is needed.
Thank you. So we're at time. Really, really appreciate, Anthony, your being here, Paul, your hosting, and our audience with really excellent questions. Anything you want to say to close us out?
Look, thanks New America for allowing us to have this conversation. It's not the easiest conversation for anybody, involved in this conversation to have, because there are things that we want that we don't have right now. We would like certainty. We'd like to have a good, you know, better bargain for the workers. And we'd like to have the support of as many constituencies as we can along the way. And look, we're going to keep working at this. And whether it's New York, whether it's Washington, D.C., whether it's some other place or in this country, we think that, while it might seem heretical to some people that a third way might make sense, we think yesterday's heresy is tomorrow's opportunity. And so we're going to continue working towards a solution. And we appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your perspectives. We really, really greatly appreciate it. And thanks everyone for your participation. We will close out here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.